Hi everyone. Today we will have less assigned questions as we did last week because I don't want you to spend too much time on weekly assignments so that you'll be able to be with your family um, and also spend more time perhaps on those core courses. So that's it. And today we are going to talk about women and the Dark Ages. Perhaps you have already heard about the term Dark Ages in works of popular culture, like novels, documentaries, TV shows, and so forth. The term itself is a historical periodization traditionally referring to the Middle Ages, an era marked, according to the theory, by demographic, cultural, and economic deterioration, as well as violence, of course, occurred in Western Europe following the fall of Roman Empire. And when you think of the so-called Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, and later the Enlightenment in the 18th century, when you think of these names, these concepts, a notion that the Middle Ages is a time of backwardness and darkness and violence seems to make perfect sense. However, this concept proves inaccurate and misleading, and therefore has been rejected by academia. By focusing on gender issues, today we are going to look into the Middle Ages and try to understand this era from a different perspective. I personally think it makes better sense when we group the three assigned sources, including Eloise's letter to Abelard, the Fabliaux written by an unknown author, and the letter from Hildegard of Bingen to the clergy of Mainz, and we try to figure out if they share similarities. So, from these three texts, as well as the textbook if necessary, I'd like you to answer first. In general, what do we learn about women's life in 12th century Europe? So, for example, you can talk about the professions and the jobs, opportunities in society, and their duties, perhaps at home and in public, and so forth. And second, I want you to try to figure out how did women themselves understand their roles in society. So it's not how their contemporaries understand their roles, but how women themselves understand themselves. And you can try to consider how these women responded gender norms and expectations, which are kind of imposed upon them, and how their writings, their own writings, and their behaviors, and also professional careers challenged those norms and also help improve your understanding of women's agency in this so-called dark ages. And among these three sources, I want you to pay more attention to the French Fabliaux. On this tale, as well as other stories of this genre, there are competing voices because the portrayal of female characters in tales like The Wife of Orleans is highly controversial. Many scholars consider this Fabliaux to be openly misogynist and at least highly critical of women, while others see the triumph of the female protagonist as refreshing and liberating. And these fabliaux renew our knowledge of women's life in the Middle Ages. So I'd like you to know, to tell me whether you think this is a feminist story or not. And in your answer to this question, you may want to compare the female characters in the Fabliaux with that of the Anglo-Saxon translation of the Book of Genesis, and perhaps also the plot of these two sources. And at last, if you are interested in knowing more about women's life and that kind of story about female agency, I recommend a book entitled The Return of Martin Guerre, written by Natalie Zemon Davis. and first published in 1983. It's a book about the 16th century, not about the so-called Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but it is amazing. It tells a fascinating story of Martin Guerre, who's a 16th century French peasant, and he's being at the very center of a famous case of imposture. Several years after Martin Guerre had left his wife, whose name is Bertrand de Rose, and also his children and his home and village, his family, a man claiming to be him appeared in the community. And this guy lived with Guerre's wife, Bertrand de Rose, and his children for several years before the return of Martin Guerre. I think this is a very, it's very famous and is interesting. It reviews so many different aspects of European life in the post Middle Ages era. And if you're interested in this book, I personally recommend this book. And you can also find a movie with the same title um, available online, I think. So, okay, that's about this week's source discussion. See you next time.